welcome. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Or, I might show up at your door. I'm just here to share some creepy stories, so sit back and enjoy. Disclaimer: the content presented in the video is purely for entertainment purposes only. The theories and stories discussed in this video are speculative and are not supported by any evidence or proof. Viewer discretion is advised. I pressed my palm against the vibration sensor display, watching the jagged lines spike across the screen in patterns that made my stomach clench. 3 years of monitoring ice dynamics in the Arctic, and I'd never seen readings like this. The seismic data showed microfractures propagating through the ice shelf at an accelerating rate, each tremor sending fresh cracks spiderwebbing beneath our monitoring station. "This can't be happening," I whispered, my breath forming small clouds in the suddenly cooler air. Cross-referencing the morning's measurements with baseline stability reports, the numbers painted a terrifying picture. What should have been solid permafrost extending 200 meters down was riddled with cavitation spaces and structural weakness that defied every geological survey we'd conducted. My hands trembled as I pulled up the historical data, desperately searching for precedent. The Larsen B collapse in 2002. The Brunt ice shelf calving in 2021. Both had shown warning signs for months, even years. This pattern suggested we had hours, maybe less. The station's metal framework groaned around me, a deep harmonic that seemed to rise from the ice itself. I could feel it through my boots, a subtle vibration that made the coffee in my mug form concentric ripples. The monitoring equipment hummed with nervous energy, screens flickering as power fluctuated through cables stressed by our shifting foundation. I reached for the emergency protocol manual, my environmental science training kicking in despite the fear crawling up my spine. Protocol demanded immediate consultation with station leadership before declaring a structural emergency. But the data was unmistakable, irregular stress patterns indicating catastrophic failure of the ice matrix supporting our entire facility. The photograph tucked beside my workstation caught my eye. Our research team's arrival photo from 18 months ago, all 4 of us grinning beside the freshly constructed monitoring array. Braun's confident smile, Alina's excited expression, Zev's focused attention on the equipment we'd spent months installing. We'd been so proud of establishing the most advanced ice dynamics research station in the Canadian Arctic. Now that same ice was betraying us. I grabbed the seismic readings and headed toward the main corridor, the metal flooring vibrating under my feet with each step. The station's heating system cycled on, but I noticed the subtle wrongness immediately. The vents weren't distributing air evenly. Temperature sensors showed cold spots where heated air should be flowing, suggesting the ductwork had shifted with the ice movement. In the communications bay, Zev was hunched over a bank of monitors, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Zev, I need you to look at these readings," I called out, but he held up a hand without turning around. "Give me a minute, Isadora. I'm getting interference on the satellite uplink. Started about an hour ago and it's getting worse." An hour ago, right when my sensors started detecting the accelerated fracturing. The timing wasn't coincidental. I spread the printouts across the nearest table, the data points forming an unmistakable pattern of structural decay. Each measurement showed the ice beneath us riddled with stress fractures, weakened by temperature fluctuations and mechanical strain that our presence had inadvertently accelerated. Braun's voice echoed from the administrative section, discussing supply schedules with someone on the radio. His tone carried the casual authority of a man who'd spent 15 years managing Arctic operations, someone who'd seen ice storms and equipment failures but never questioned the fundamental stability of the ground beneath his feet. I thought about the previous monitoring station, abandoned 2 years before our arrival. The official report cited routine relocation due to shifting research priorities, but I'd glimpsed a classified addendum during my security clearance briefing that mentioned structural concerns with foundation integrity. The bureaucrats had known. They'd established our station here knowing the ice was questionable. My breath fogged more noticeably in the cooling air, and I realized the heating system failure was accelerating. The station was losing thermal regulation, which meant the permafrost beneath us was warming faster than our systems could compensate. Each degree of temperature increase weakened the ice matrix exponentially. I had to make a choice: follow protocol and report through proper channels, or sound the immediate evacuation alarm based on data that painted a picture of imminent catastrophe. 3 years of careful research methodology warred with every survival instinct screaming that we needed to leave this place immediately. The vibration sensor clipped to my belt buzzed with an urgent alert. I checked the display to see fresh readings that made my vision blur with panic. The ice shelf wasn't just cracking. It was beginning to separate from the main glacier, a process that would turn our research station into floating debris within hours. Outside the reinforced windows, the endless white expanse of the Arctic stretched to the horizon, beautiful and deceptively peaceful. No visible sign of the catastrophe brewing beneath our feet. No indication that the ice supporting our entire facility was systematically failing from within. But I could feel it now. The subtle wrongness in the way the station settled, the metallic stress sounds echoing through the walls, the way my equipment registered micro-vibrations that shouldn't exist on stable permafrost. The ice wasn't just cracking. It was disintegrating from within, and we were trapped on top of a geological disaster that official reports had tried to hide. I tucked the seismic readings into my jacket and headed toward Braun's office, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether we had any chance of surviving what was coming. The station groaned around me, metal and ice singing a harmony of structural failure that I was probably the only person here qualified to interpret. The responsibility felt crushing. These people trusted the ground beneath their feet, trusted the engineers who'd built this place, trusted the bureaucrats who'd assured them it was safe. Only I knew how catastrophically wrong they all were, and only I could decide what to do about it. The lights flickered as I rushed into Braun's office, the seismic readings clutched against my chest. He looked up from his radio console, eyebrows raised at my urgent entrance. But before either of us could speak, another power fluctuation plunged the room into shadows for 3 long seconds. "We need to evacuate. Now." I spread the printouts across his desk, pointing to the most damning measurements. "The ice beneath us is failing faster than anything I've seen in the geological record." Braun studied the data for 30 seconds, his weathered face grave. As station security chief, he'd survived 2 decades of Arctic operations by trusting expert analysis while maintaining healthy skepticism. "How certain are you about this timeline?" 98%. The number came out steady despite my racing pulse. Cross-referenced with thermal sensors, structural stress indicators, and vibration analysis. "We're sitting on top of a catastrophic failure in progress." The radio crackled with static, then Zev's voice cut through. "Braun, I'm losing satellite communication. Something's interfering with our uplink array." Braun keyed his microphone. "Equipment malfunction or atmospheric?" "Neither. The interference pattern suggests our transmission dish is shifting position. Physical displacement of the hardware." I felt the blood drain from my face. "The communications array is mounted on the station's north foundation pylon. If that's moving..." Another power fluctuation, longer this time, sent the overhead lights dimming to emergency levels before struggling back to full brightness. The station's generators kicked in with a mechanical whine, their vibration adding another layer to the subtle trembling I could feel through the floor. Braun stood, his decision-making instincts engaging. "Alina's in the research lab. Get her up here while I check the structural integrity sensors." I hurried toward the laboratory complex, noticing how the corridor walls showed hairline cracks near the joints where different sections connected. The station had been constructed in modular segments, designed to flex with minor ice movement. These cracks suggested stress beyond design specifications. The temperature had dropped noticeably. My breath formed visible puffs as the heating system struggled against cold air infiltrating through gaps that hadn't existed 12 hours ago. Each degree of temperature loss meant the permafrost beneath us was destabilizing faster. I found Alina organizing ice core samples in sealed containers, her movements methodical despite the increasingly unstable environment. As research team leader, she maintained focus under pressure, the kind of scientist who documented everything even when crisis threatened. "Alina, Braun needs you upstairs immediately. We have a structural emergency." She looked up from her samples, noting my expression. "How bad?" "Evacuation level bad. The ice shelf is separating from the main glacier." Her face went pale, but she methodically secured her equipment before following me toward the administrative level. Halfway up the stairs, the entire station shuddered. A deep, resonant movement that lasted 3 seconds and left us gripping the handrails. "That wasn't seismic," Alina said quietly. "That was structural settlement." We reached Braun's office to find him studying readouts from the Foundation monitoring system, his expression grim. The displays showed stress loads exceeding design parameters across multiple support points. "South Foundation pylon is experiencing lateral displacement," he reported. 6 centimeters in the past hour. "North pylon is showing vertical subsidence." Zev's voice crackled over the intercom. "Communication array is completely offline. I'm reading power fluctuations in the main electrical grid. Backup generators are compensating, but we're losing system redundancy." I spread additional sensor data across Braun's desk, pointing to the accelerating measurements. "The ice fracturing is propagating in a specific pattern. This isn't random deterioration. It's following pre-existing structural weaknesses that weren't identified during site surveys." Alina examined the data with practiced efficiency. "These fracture lines, they're consistent with thermal expansion damage. Something caused significant temperature fluctuations in the subsurface ice before we arrived." "The previous monitoring station," I said, the pieces clicking together. "The classified reports mentioned Foundation integrity concerns. They knew this location was compromised and built our facility here anyway." Braun's jaw tightened. "Bureaucratic cost-cutting. Cheaper to risk personnel than relocate to stable ice." Another shudder ran through the station, accompanied by the sound of metal under stress. The lights flickered in a pattern that suggested multiple electrical connections were failing simultaneously. "We need to move to the emergency shelter," Braun decided. "If the main structure fails, the reinforced communications bunker is our best chance." As we gathered essential equipment, I noticed how the facility was betraying its structural integrity. The corridor floors sloped slightly where foundation settlement created new angles. Condensation from temperature fluctuations pooled in corners that had been dry yesterday. The walls showed hairline fractures where thermal stress exceeded material tolerances. Zev met us at the equipment lockers, his arms full of emergency radio gear. "Main power grid just lost another circuit. We're running on backup systems for everything except life support." "How long can the generators maintain heating?" Alina asked. 18 hours if we're conservative. 12 if we lose more electrical load." The implications hit me immediately. Without heating, the station's interior temperature would drop below survival levels within hours. But maintaining power meant running generators that vibrated the already unstable foundation. "There's something else," Zev continued, his voice dropping. "I've been monitoring unauthorized seismic activity for the past 3 weeks. Low-frequency pulses that don't match natural ice movement." Braun stopped loading emergency supplies. "Unauthorized how?" "Artificial vibrations. Regular intervals, specific frequency patterns. Someone's been conducting subsurface testing without our knowledge." The revelation sent ice through my veins. Seismic testing would destabilize compromised ice matrices. If someone's been running geological surveys beneath us, they knew, Alina said quietly. They knew the ice was failing, and they sent teams to accelerate the process. Another massive shudder shook the station, this one accompanied by the screech of metal tearing. Through the reinforced windows, I could see the communications array tilting at an impossible angle, its support tower buckled from foundation movement. "We're moving to the emergency bunker. Now." Braun shouldered his pack and headed toward the reinforced corridor leading to our backup facility. As we navigated toward the emergency bunker, I cataloged the escalating signs of structural failure. Ceiling panels sagging where support brackets had loosened, floor sections cracking along stress lines, ventilation ducts hanging askew from mounting points that could no longer hold their weight. The emergency bunker was a separate structure connected by an enclosed walkway, designed to survive catastrophic failure of the main station. But as we approached the connecting corridor, I realized our situation was worse than anyone had anticipated. The walkway showed visible separation from both buildings, gaps that hadn't existed during yesterday's routine inspection. The reinforced glass panels were spiderwebbed with stress fractures, and the metal framework groaned under loads it wasn't designed to handle. The bunker's foundation is failing too, I reported, checking readings from portable sensors. Whatever's destabilizing the ice is affecting the entire area. Braun paused at the walkway entrance, weighing options. Risk crossing to uncertain shelter, or stay in the main station until it collapses. Through the damaged windows, the Arctic landscape stretched endlessly in all directions. No visible rescue options, no alternative shelter, no escape route across ice that could give way without warning. The seismic activity Zev detected, I said, a terrible thought forming. What if it wasn't testing? What if someone's been deliberately destabilizing this site? The question hung in the air as another vibration shook the station. Stronger than before, lasting longer, accompanied by sounds of metal and ice singing their harmony of destruction. We were trapped between a collapsing station and an uncertain bunker, on ice that someone might have sabotaged, with no communication to the outside world and limited time before our heating failed. The disaster was spreading beyond anything our emergency protocols had anticipated. The emergency bunker's reinforced door sealed behind us with a pneumatic hiss, cutting off the groaning sounds from the main station. I immediately checked the structural integrity sensors while Braun activated the independent power systems. The bunker's thick walls muffled the worst of the vibrations, but I could still feel the ice shifting beneath us through the floor. Internal systems operational, Braun reported, switching on the emergency lighting. We've got 72 hours of power and heat if we're conservative. Alina spread her research files across the bunker's central table, her movements precise despite our circumstances. I need to show you something I found in the archived geological surveys. She pulled out a folder marked with security classifications I'd never seen before. These reports were buried in the station's database under obsolete file codes. I moved closer as she opened the folder, revealing detailed ice composition analyses and thermal imaging surveys from our exact location. The data was 3 months old, collected before our team's arrival. According to this, Alina continued, pointing to thermal maps, the ice shelf beneath our station was already compromised when construction began. Massive internal fracturing, thermal instability, structural weakness throughout the foundation zone. Zev looked up from his communication equipment. That's impossible. Site surveys cleared this location as stable for minimum 10 years. The official surveys did. Alina pulled out another document. But these classified assessments tell a different story. Someone knew we were building on failing ice. Braun studied the thermal imaging data, his expression darkening. These fracture patterns, they match what we're experiencing now. They knew exactly how the collapse would progress. Betrayal shock hit me like physical pain as the implications crystallized. They sent us here knowing the station would fail. We're not monitoring ice stability. We're documenting a controlled collapse. Another vibration shook the bunker, this one lasting 5 full seconds. Through the reinforced observation window, I watched the main station's north section sag visibly as its foundation gave way. The twisted remains of our communications array lay scattered across fractured ice that hadn't existed this morning. There's more, Zev said quietly. Those unauthorized seismic pulses I detected? I've been recording them. He activated his monitoring equipment, playing back 3 weeks of data. Listen to the pattern. The recorded vibrations played through the speakers. Regular, rhythmic pulses that clearly weren't natural phenomena. They occurred in precise intervals, always at the same frequency, always targeting the same subsurface locations. Someone's been using focused vibration to accelerate the ice fracturing, I realized. Deliberate structural sabotage. Alina pulled out the final document from her folder, a communication log between the station's administrative office and an unknown external source. These radio transmissions were automatically archived by our systems. Look at the timestamps. The messages dated back 6 weeks, showing regular communication between someone at our station and coordinates that matched no official research facility or government installation. The content was heavily coded, but certain phrases stood out. Acceleration protocol confirmed. Foundation stress optimal. Proceed to next phase. Someone on our team has been reporting to external operators, Braun said, his voice carrying the weight of command authority. Someone's been feeding information to whoever's orchestrating this collapse. I checked the transmission logs against our duty schedules, cross-referencing who had access to communications equipment during each contact window. The pattern emerged clearly. Transmissions occurred during specific shift rotations when one person consistently had unsupervised access to the radio room. Zev. I turned to face him, pieces falling into place. You've had solo communications duty for every single one of these transmission windows. His face went pale, but not with surprise, with the look of someone whose carefully maintained deception had finally crumbled. You don't understand the situation we're in. Then explain it. Braun's hand moved instinctively toward the emergency restraint equipment standard in Arctic bunkers. Zev set down his radio equipment slowly, his engineer's precision now carrying a different meaning. The ice shelf was going to collapse anyway. The thermal surveys from last year showed catastrophic failure within 18 months. Guaranteed. That doesn't justify sabotage, Alina said. It does when the alternative is worse. Zev's voice carried desperate conviction. The agency running this operation needed specific data on progressive ice failure. Real-time measurements during controlled collapse versus waiting for random catastrophic failure. I felt sick as the full scope became clear. You've been helping them accelerate the timeline so they could gather research data. Research that will save thousands of lives when other ice shelves fail naturally, Zev insisted. The choice wasn't between safety and danger. It was between controlled documentation and blind catastrophe. Braun's training took over, his voice steady and authoritative. Who are you reporting to? Climate Research Consortium. Classified programs studying rapid ice failure mechanisms. They needed data that couldn't be gathered any other way. By risking our lives without consent, I said, by accepting risks that were already inevitable. Zev pulled out his personal radio, different from the station's standard equipment. I can contact them. Emergency evacuation protocols. They have assets positioned for immediate response. The bunker shuddered again, this time accompanied by the distant sound of the main station structure giving way completely. Through the observation window, I watched entire sections collapse into the widening cracks in the ice. How do we know you're telling the truth about evacuation support? Alina demanded. Zev activated his personal radio, speaking into it with codes I didn't recognize. The response came back immediately. Coordinates for emergency pickup, timeline for helicopter extraction, confirmation of our exact situation and position. They've been monitoring everything, he admitted. Complete oversight of the collapse progression. They can extract us safely. Braun studied the evacuation coordinates on Zev's display. Pickup zone is 2 kilometers across unstable ice. In current conditions, that's a death march for anyone not in peak physical condition. I realized what he meant. Alina's recent injury from the station collapse had left her with limited mobility. The trek across failing ice to reach the evacuation point would be impossible for her in current conditions. There's another option, Zev said. The emergency cache at grid reference 7 Alpha. Closer location, better shelter, but it only stocks supplies for 2 people for 48 hours. The weight of leadership settled on my shoulders as I realized someone had to make an impossible choice. The consortium had orchestrated this disaster, but they might also be our only path out. Zev's betrayal stung, but his connections could mean the difference between death and survival. Yet, accepting their help meant becoming complicit in whatever larger scheme had put us here. The data they wanted, real-time measurements of controlled ice collapse, would cost lives when applied to other sites. How many other research teams might find themselves in similar situations if this operation succeeded? The radio signals you've been monitoring, I said to Zev. Are there other stations experiencing similar failures? His silence confirmed my worst fears. How long before the consortium's timeline calls for final phase? I asked. Zev checked his radio. 16 hours. They're expecting complete ice shelf separation by 0800 tomorrow. And if we don't evacuate by then, the ice will be too unstable for helicopter extraction. We'd be stranded until the spring thaw allows ship access. 6 months. The bunker supplies wouldn't last 6 weeks, much less 6 months. Another massive vibration shook our shelter, followed by the unmistakable sound of ice cracking under enormous pressure. The emergency lighting flickered as the bunker's foundation absorbed stresses beyond its design limits. Decision point, Braun announced. We commit to evacuation with full group risk, split the team between locations, or trust Zev's handlers to extract us from an increasingly unstable situation. I looked around the bunker at my colleagues. 3 people whose lives depended on the choice we made in the next few minutes. Alina, injured but determined. Braun, experienced but bound by responsibility for everyone's safety. Zev, whose betrayal might be our only path to survival. The radio crackled with another transmission from Zev's consortium contacts. Confirmation required for extraction protocol. Teams must confirm participation in final documentation phase. They want us to keep recording data during the evacuation. I realized. We're not just being rescued, we're being used as instruments for their research until the very end. The bunker's structure groaned as another section of ice gave way somewhere beneath us. Time was running out, and every choice carried the weight of survival against the cost of complicity in the operation that had put us here. My determination surged despite the impossible odds. We couldn't let this operation succeed, but we also couldn't let our team die to stop it. There had to be a way to survive and expose what was happening here. Show me the exact evacuation routes, I demanded. All of them. The decision hung in the bunker's stale air for exactly 37 seconds before the ice made it for us. A sound like thunder rolled beneath the bunker, followed by a sickening lurch that threw me against the wall. The emergency lights strobed once, twice, then died completely. In the absolute darkness, I heard Alina cry out as something heavy crashed to the floor. Emergency illumination! Braun's voice cut through the chaos. Chemical light sticks cracked and hissed to life, casting everything in harsh green shadows. The bunker had tilted 15 degrees. All our equipment had slid into the far corner, including the radio gear and Zev's personal communicator. But that wasn't the worst part. Water was seeping through the bunker's floor seams. Not the slow condensation we dealt with before, but active infiltration that meant the ice beneath us had cracked through to the ocean. Structural integrity compromised, I reported, checking the manual systems that still functioned. We've got maybe 20 minutes before this compartment becomes uninhabitable. Alina struggled to stand, favoring her injured leg more heavily now. The impact had worsened her condition significantly. The research data, it's all in the water. I watched months of critical environmental monitoring dissolve into the spreading puddle on the bunker floor. Years of baseline measurements, irreplaceable scientific observations, all the documentation we'd risked our lives to maintain, gone. Zev was frantically working to salvage his radio equipment from the water. The emergency transponder is waterlogged. I can't reach the consortium. Good, Braun said grimly, because I just realized something about those evacuation coordinates. He pulled out the waterproof map case from the emergency supplies. Grid reference 7 Alpha is the same location mentioned in those archived reports Alina found. I studied the map coordinates. The pickup zone Zev's handlers had designated was directly over the thermal instability zone the classified surveys had identified as the primary failure point. They're not extracting us, I said, the betrayal hitting like physical pain. They want us at ground zero when the final collapse occurs. Zev's face went white in the chemical light. That's impossible. They confirmed safe extraction protocols. Another massive shudder ran through the ice shelf. This time, the sound was different. Not the grinding of ice under pressure, but the sharp crack of complete structural separation. Through the bunker's observation window, I could see the main station sliding away from us across a widening gap in the ice. We just lost the entire eastern section, Braun reported. Everything from the communications tower to the generator building just went into the ocean. The water level in the bunker was rising faster now. Whatever was left of the ice beneath us was failing in real time. I checked my watch, 0247 hours. Dawn was still 4 hours away, but the consortium expected their final data collection to begin at 0800. The emergency cache, Alina said through gritted teeth. How far did you say it was? 800 meters northwest, I replied, consulting the emergency protocols manual. But that route crosses 3 different ice zones that are now actively failing. As opposed to staying here and drowning? Braun asked. The water reached my ankles. The bunker's heating system had failed when we lost power, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. In these conditions, hypothermia would set in within minutes of leaving the shelter. Emergency survival gear inventory, I called out, forcing myself to focus on immediate problems. What do we have for extended cold weather travel? Braun checked the supply lockers that weren't underwater. 4 cold weather suits, rated to -40. Emergency shelter for 2 people. 60 hours of chemical heating pads. Food for 3 days. Medical supplies? I looked at Alina, whose condition was deteriorating visibly. Basic trauma kit, pain medication, splinting materials. Nothing for serious injury stabilization. The radio crackled to life. Zev had managed to get partial function from the water-damaged equipment. The transmission was breaking up, but I could make out enough to understand the message. Final phase initiated ahead of schedule. Structural separation confirmed. All personnel expendable for data completion. Zev stared at the radio in horror. They're not planning to extract anyone. The whole operation was designed to document complete team mortality during ice collapse. Research subjects, Alina said bitterly. Not colleagues, not human beings. Just data points in their climate study. The bunker lurched again, this time tilting another 10 degrees. Equipment that hadn't already slid into the water crashed against the far wall. The observation window showed nothing but black ocean water where solid ice had been minutes before. Decision time, Braun announced. We attempt the trek to the emergency cache now, while we still have some ice to travel on, or we stay here and document our own deaths for whatever agency Zev's been working for. I checked the emergency beacon mounted on the bunker wall. Still functional, but the signal would only reach about 5 kilometers in optimal conditions. In the current storm, maybe half that range. Who else knows our situation? I asked Zev. The consortium has complete monitoring data, but the official research program thinks we're conducting routine ice stability measurements. They're not expecting contact for another 48 hours. So if we don't reach the emergency cache, nobody's coming to look for us until the scheduled check-in, which is when? 72 hours from our last official contact. The water in the bunker reached my knees. The chemical lighting was starting to fail, casting everything in increasingly dim green shadows. I could hear Alina's breathing becoming labored. The cold and stress were taking their toll on her injury. Equipment priorities, I said, accepting that we had no choice but to attempt the trek. What's absolutely essential for survival? Braun was already sorting through the salvageable supplies. Cold weather gear, emergency shelter, heating elements, basic medical kit, emergency food, and the manual beacon. The research data? Alina asked. I looked at the waterlogged equipment, months of scientific work reduced to useless electronic components. Gone. We're not scientists anymore, we're survivors. Zev held up his damaged radio. I might be able to get intermittent communication if we can reach higher ground. To call who? Braun demanded. The people who sent us here to die? Maybe someone else. Official channels. Emergency services. With what power? That equipment's dying, and we don't have generator capacity for extended operation. The bunker's structure groaned ominously. Whatever ice remained beneath us was failing rapidly. Through the observation window, I could see chunks of debris from the main station floating in the dark water. Pieces of our former home disappearing into the Arctic night. 30 seconds, I announced. Final equipment check, then we go. Alina struggled into her cold weather suit, her movements slow and painful. I'll slow you down, then we all move at your pace, Braun said firmly. Nobody gets left behind. Zev secured the partially functional radio in a waterproof case. If we can reach the emergency cache, I can try to establish contact with official rescue services instead of the consortium. You think they'll believe us? I asked. A story about classified ice research and controlled collapse operations? They'll believe an emergency distress call from a failing research station. The water reached my waist. The bunker's buoyancy was failing as the airspaces flooded. We had minutes at most before the entire structure went under. Move out, I ordered, activating the emergency exit mechanism. The hatch opened onto a hellscape of fractured ice and freezing spray. What had been solid ground that morning was now a maze of unstable ice flows separated by black water. The emergency cache was somewhere in that chaos, our only hope of surviving until official rescue could reach us. But first, we had to cross 800 meters of disintegrating Arctic ice while carrying an injured team member and limited supplies, in complete darkness, during a storm that showed no signs of letting up. The bunker's final lights died behind us as we stepped onto the failing ice shelf. Ahead lay either salvation or the same death the consortium had planned for us, but at least now it would be on our terms. The ice cracked ominously under our feet as we began the most dangerous trek of our lives. The ice held us for exactly 47 steps before I heard the sound that meant we were all going to die. Not the sharp crack of surface fracturing, but the deep, resonant groan of structural failure that travels through solid ice when the foundation beneath gives way. I'd heard it once before during my training simulations when they showed us footage of ice shelf collapses. Stop moving, I whispered, though the wind probably carried my words away. We were strung out single file across what looked like solid ice, but I could feel the subtle motion beneath my feet, the rhythmic flex that meant we were standing on a floating slab. Braun, leading our makeshift column, held up his fist. Military hand signals felt absurd out here, but they worked. Behind me, I heard Alina's labored breathing as she struggled to maintain our pace. Her injured leg was deteriorating faster than any of us wanted to admit. Zev brought up the rear, clutching his waterproofed radio gear like a talisman. Every few minutes he'd stop to adjust the antenna, searching for any signal that might represent legitimate rescue rather than the consortium's death watch. How much farther? Alina's voice was tight with pain and effort. I checked my GPS unit, one of the few pieces of equipment that had survived the bunker's flooding. 420 meters to the cache. But we need to find a route that doesn't cross open water. The emergency cache was our only hope, a weatherproof shelter stocked with supplies for exactly this scenario. But the route the emergency protocol specified was now a maze of unstable ice flows and black ocean gaps. The thermal imaging in my survival gear showed heat signatures that meant the ice beneath us was far thinner than it should be. There, Braun pointed to a series of what looked like solid ice bridges connecting the larger flows. We can make it across those. I studied the route through my scope. Those aren't natural formations. Look at the edges, too regular, too uniform. What are you saying? I'm saying someone's been modifying the ice structure, deliberately weakening specific areas while reinforcing others. The implications hit all of us simultaneously. The consortium hadn't just been monitoring the ice collapse, they'd been orchestrating it, creating controlled failure points, establishing observation positions, turning our research station into a real-time laboratory for studying human behavior under extreme duress. The emergency cache, Zev said slowly. What if it's not stocked with survival supplies? What if it's stocked with monitoring equipment? I finished. Cameras, sensors, data collection gear. Everything needed to document our final hours in precise detail. Alina sank heavily onto the ice, her strength finally giving out. So we're walking into another trap. I knelt beside her, checking her injury status. The cold had slowed the bleeding, but her mobility was compromised severely. In these conditions, without proper medical intervention, she had maybe 6 hours before hypothermia became irreversible. Options assessment, I said, forcing myself to think like the environmental specialist I'd trained to be rather than the terrified human I'd become. We can continue to the cache and hope it contains actual survival supplies. We can attempt to reach the mainland on foot across unstable ice. Or we can find shelter and wait for legitimate rescue. How long for rescue? Braun asked. Official check-in protocol requires contact every 72 hours. We're 36 hours into the current cycle, so 36 hours minimum before anyone realizes we're missing. And that's assuming they believe our situation rather than accepting whatever cover story the consortium provides. Zev activated his radio, managing to pick up the consortium's monitoring frequency. The transmission that came through made my blood freeze. Behavioral responses within predicted parameters. Recommend extending observation timeline. Subjects demonstrating expected adaptation to resource scarcity. Turn it off, Alina said. I don't want to hear anymore, but I did want to hear more. Because buried in that transmission was something that gave me hope, a reference to extending observation timeline. They needed us alive longer than just tonight. The cache had to contain actual supplies if they wanted to continue their study. They're not ready for us to die yet, I told the others. Whatever study they're conducting requires extended observation. That transmission mentioned extending the timeline. So the cache might be legitimate? It has to be. They need us functional for whatever data they're collecting. Braun studied the route ahead through his scope. The ice bridges are deteriorating. We need to move now or find another way. There is no other way, I said, checking my map against the GPS readings. The cache is on high ground, probably the only stable position left in this area. Then we go, Alina said, struggling to stand. But I need help. I looked at our equipment distribution. The emergency shelter weighed 18 kilograms. The heating elements added another 12. Medical supplies, food, communication gear. We were carrying nearly 60 kilograms of essential equipment across unstable ice, while supporting an injured team member in conditions that were deteriorating by the hour. Load redistribution, I announced. We're carrying too much weight for these conditions. What do we leave behind? Zev asked. I inventoried our supplies against actual survival requirements. The research equipment stays. The backup radio gear stays. We keep one heating unit, minimal medical supplies, emergency food for 48 hours. That's not enough for extended survival, Braun protested. It's enough to reach the cache. If the cache doesn't have supplies, none of this equipment will matter anyway. Alina was shivering uncontrollably now. The cold was affecting her judgment as well as her mobility. The environmental data, 3 years of baseline measurements, we can't just abandon it. Yes, we can, I said firmly. We're not scientists anymore. We're survivors. But even as I said it, I was thinking about the implications of losing that data. The environmental monitoring we'd been conducting represented 3 years of critical Arctic baseline measurements. Without it, climate predictions for this entire region would be compromised. 5 minutes, I announced. Final equipment decisions, then we move. Zev was already stripping down his radio gear, keeping only the essential components for emergency communication. If we reach the cache, I can try to establish contact with official emergency services instead of the consortium channels. They'll believe a straightforward distress call. They have to respond to any emergency beacon activation. Legal requirement. Assuming our beacon reaches anyone. Assuming we survive long enough to activate it. The ice beneath us shifted again, a subtle motion that reminded me how precarious our position was. We were standing on maybe 2 meters of ice above 4,000 meters of Arctic Ocean. The water temperature was -2 degrees Celsius. Survival time in those conditions would be measured in minutes, not hours. "Personal items," I said, making the hardest decision of my professional life. "Everything non-essential stays here." I dropped my personal research notes, months of painstaking observations and analysis, onto the ice. Bron abandoned his emergency protocols manual and personal gear. Zev left his technical equipment documentation. Alina clutched her field journal. "My father's notes are in here. His Arctic research from 40 years ago." "Alina, I know," she said, placing the journal carefully on the abandoned equipment pile. Survival over sentiment. But I picked up the journal and stuffed it into my emergency pack. Some things were worth the extra weight. "Route analysis," I said, studying the path ahead. We crossed the ice bridges in single-file, 10-meter spacing. If one section gives way, the others have reaction time. "What if the cache is compromised?" Bron asked. "Then we improvise." "What if it's another monitoring station?" "Then we turn their equipment against them." "What if there's no cache at all?" I looked at him steadily. "Then we die. But we die on our terms, not theirs." The wind was picking up, driving ice crystals across the deteriorating surface like frozen bullets. Visibility was dropping rapidly. If we didn't move soon, we'd lose the ability to navigate to the cache at all. "Final check," I announced. "Essential equipment only. Emergency beacon activated. Radio gear secured. Medical supplies distributed." "How do we know the cache isn't just another trap?" Alina asked. "We don't," I admitted. "But staying here guarantees we die. Moving gives us a chance. Some chance. Better than none." I helped Alina to her feet, noting how much effort the simple movement required. Her reserve strength was nearly exhausted. Whatever happened next, this would be our only attempt to reach safety. "Stay together," I ordered. "If anyone goes through the ice, the others maintain position and execute extraction protocols. Nobody attempts individual rescue operations." "Understood." "If the cache is compromised, we establish defensive positions and signal for legitimate rescue." "What if legitimate rescue doesn't exist?" I looked across the fractured landscape toward where the emergency cache should be waiting. "Then we make our own." The first ice bridge held our weight. The second groaned under the load but remained stable. By the third crossing, I could see the cache structure ahead, a weatherproof emergency shelter exactly where the protocols indicated it should be. But something was wrong. The building looked too new, too deliberately positioned. And there were subtle signs around the perimeter that made my environmental training sound alarm bells. The question was whether we had enough strength left to deal with whatever we'd find there, and whether Alina could survive the trek back if the cache proved to be another monitoring station rather than our salvation. The emergency cache was a lie, but not in the way I'd expected. As we approached the weatherproof shelter, I could see fresh footprints in the snow around the perimeter, boot treads that didn't match any of our equipment. The building itself looked exactly like emergency protocol specifications, but the ventilation systems were wrong. Too sophisticated, too precisely positioned for simple survival shelter. "Motion sensors," Zev whispered, pointing to barely visible equipment housings mounted on the structure's corners. "This isn't a cache. It's an observation post." But Alina was collapsing. Her injured leg finally gave out completely, sending her sprawling onto the ice 20 meters from the building. The hypothermia was winning. I could see it in her unfocused eyes, her slurred speech, the way her hands couldn't grip her equipment properly. "We go in," I decided. "Whatever this place is, it has heat and shelter. Without that, Alina dies in the next hour." Bron checked his sidearm, a precaution that felt both essential and ridiculous in these conditions. "If it's a trap, we're walking directly into it. If it's not shelter, we're walking directly into death." The door wasn't locked. That should have been our first warning. Inside, the space was divided into two distinct areas. a functional survival shelter complete with heating elements, emergency supplies and communication equipment, and a sophisticated monitoring station with banks of screens, data collection servers, and real-time transmission gear. The screens were active, displaying feeds from cameras I now realized had been positioned throughout our entire ordeal. I could see footage of our station collapse, our desperate trek across the ice, even conversations we thought were private. But what made me understand the true scope of their study was the wall of monitors showing similar operations in progress. Arctic stations across the region, some collapsing, some intact, all occupied by research teams who had no idea they were being studied. "This isn't just about us," I said, reviewing the footage. "This is a comprehensive behavioral study. Multiple sites, multiple teams, standardized crisis scenarios." Zev was examining the communication equipment. "And this gear is connected to legitimate emergency services. We can actually call for real rescue." "They want us to call for rescue," Braun realized. "That's part of the study, documenting how different teams respond to the same emergency conditions." I was reading through the research protocols displayed on the monitors. The consortium study was designed to evaluate human decision-making under extreme stress, measuring variables like group cohesion, leadership emergence, resource allocation, and moral choice patterns. We were Laboratory Group 7. "Look at this," Alina said weakly from where I'd helped her onto a heating pad. She was pointing to a status board showing all the active study sites. "Group 3 died. Complete team loss 2 days ago. Group 5 abandoned their injured member to save themselves. Group 12 is still trapped but expected to survive." "They're comparing our responses to other teams facing identical scenarios," I said, "measuring who lives, who dies, who abandons who fights together." The heating elements were bringing Alina's core temperature back to survivable levels, but she was still in serious medical trouble. The emergency supplies included actual medical equipment, advanced enough to stabilize her condition but not enough to fully treat her injuries. "Emergency beacon," Zev announced, activating the legitimate distress signal. "Real rescue services are responding. Estimated arrival in 6 hours. 6 hours in perfect conditions," Braun corrected. "Could be longer depending on weather." I was studying the research data, understanding finally what we'd been put through. The ice collapse wasn't natural, but it wasn't artificially triggered either. The consortium had identified naturally unstable ice formations and positioned monitoring stations on them, then waited for natural failure to occur. They'd been running this study for 3 years. 26 teams total. Survival rate was approximately 60%. "We're going to live," I told the others, "but only because we made the choices they wanted us to make." "What do you mean?" I pointed to the behavioral analysis charts displayed on the monitors. "Look at the variables they're measuring. Group cohesion versus individual survival instinct. Professional duty versus personal preservation. Resource sharing versus resource hoarding. They wanted us to stay together. They wanted to see if we would stay together. Whether we'd abandon Alina to save ourselves. Whether we'd prioritize equipment over people. Whether we'd trust each other when the systems failed." The truth was both more and less disturbing than I'd imagined. The consortium hadn't created our crisis. They'd simply documented it with scientific precision. The moral choices we'd faced were real. The threat to our lives had been genuine. Our survival had depended on our actual decisions, not scripted outcomes. But knowing we were being studied changed everything about what those decisions meant. "The other teams?" Alina asked. "The ones who didn't make it. Was that because they made different choices?" I reviewed the casualty data. Group 3 had split up during their evacuation attempt, each member trying to save different pieces of equipment. They'd gotten separated in bad weather and frozen individually. Group 5 had left their injured member behind to maintain faster movement speed, but the injured person had been carrying essential navigation equipment, and the remaining team had gotten lost. Different choices, same crisis scenarios. They're measuring how group dynamics affect survival rates under controlled conditions. "So what happens now?" Zev asked. Do they publish our behavioral patterns in some research journal? Now we decide what story we tell the rescue teams, Braun said. Do we report the consortium study? Do we expose this operation? I thought about the implications. Exposing the study would prevent future teams from being subjected to this kind of psychological experimentation. But it would also mean admitting that our survival had been part of someone else's research design. More importantly, the data being collected might actually be valuable. Understanding how groups respond to extreme crisis could improve emergency protocols, disaster response training, survival education programs. The moral choice wasn't over just because we'd reached safety. They let us find this monitoring station, I realized. This is part of the study too, measuring how we respond to learning we've been observed. What do you mean? I pointed to the research protocols. Phase 7, Subject Response to Observation Awareness. They're documenting whether we report the study, whether we cooperate with ongoing research, whether we try to sabotage other group observations. So every choice we make is still being measured. Until the rescue teams arrive, yes. Alina's condition was stabilizing under the emergency medical treatment, but she was still in no condition to travel. We had to wait for the rescue team regardless of what we decided about the consortium. Vote, I announced. Do we report this as a natural disaster with equipment malfunction? Or do we expose the behavioral study? What are the consequences of each choice? Braun asked. Report natural disaster. Other teams continue to be studied, but potentially valuable research continues. Expose the study. Research stops. No more teams are put at risk, but potentially useful survival data is lost. And they're measuring which choice we make. They're measuring which choice we make. The rescue beacon was transmitting steadily, and Zev had established radio contact with legitimate emergency services. Real help was coming, but we had hours to decide how much truth we wanted to tell them. Personal decision, Alina said from her makeshift medical station. I vote to report the truth. Whatever the research value, people deserve to know the risks they're accepting. Agreed, said Zev. Scientific ethics require informed consent. These teams never consented to psychological experimentation, but the survival data could save lives in future genuine emergencies, I argued. If this research improves emergency protocols, more people survive real disasters. That's utilitarian reasoning, Braun pointed out. The same logic the consortium is using. He was right. The consortium believed their research justified putting teams at risk because the data might prevent future deaths. I was arguing the same position from the other side. Final decision, I said. When rescue arrives, do we maintain operational security about the monitoring equipment, or do we report the full situation? We voted 3-1 in favor of full disclosure. I was the dissenting vote, but I accepted the group decision. Just as we'd done throughout the crisis, we would act as a team rather than individuals. The rescue helicopter arrived in 4 hours and 20 minutes, faster than predicted due to improving weather conditions. The medical team stabilized Alina for transport, and we were evacuated to a proper medical facility without complications. During debriefing, we reported the full scope of the consortium study. The investigation that followed shut down 17 active monitoring sites and prevented at least 8 additional teams from being subjected to similar psychological experimentation. But I kept copies of the survival data we'd discovered. 6 months later, I used that information to develop improved emergency protocols for Arctic research stations. The behavioral analysis helped identify decision patterns that improved survival rates, resource allocation strategies that enhanced group cohesion under stress, and communication procedures that reduced panic responses during system failures. The consortium's research, despite its ethical problems, contained genuinely valuable survival information. 23 people have survived genuine Arctic emergencies using protocols derived from that data. Alina recovered full mobility after extensive physical therapy, though she still experiences pain during cold weather. She returned to environmental research but transferred to temperate climate studies. Zev became a consultant for emergency communication systems, specializing in equipment that functions under extreme conditions. His work has improved rescue coordination for multiple disaster scenarios. Braun left Arctic research entirely and now runs survival training programs for emergency responders. He teaches decision-making under extreme stress, group leadership during crisis situations, and ethical choice-making when lives are at stake. I continued environmental monitoring, but I also became involved in research ethics oversight. I review study protocols to ensure that research subjects understand the actual risks they're accepting and that the potential benefits justify any dangers involved. The consortium was prosecuted for conducting research on human subjects without informed consent. Several executives received prison sentences, and the organization was permanently banned from conducting behavioral studies. But their data, our data, continues to save lives. We survived because we made the right choices under impossible conditions. We saved other people because we chose to tell the truth about what those conditions actually were. The cost of our survival was measured in months of psychological recovery, permanent physical consequences for Alina, and the knowledge that our worst moments had been clinically observed and scientifically analyzed. The cost of our honesty was measured in the loss of potentially valuable research that could have improved survival rates for future emergency situations. But some costs are worth paying. Some choices are worth making even when you know they're being measured. The ice is still cracking beneath Arctic monitoring stations. But now the people working there know what risks they're actually accepting, and they're better prepared to survive when the systems fail. The consortium failed in their primary objective. They wanted to study human behavior under extreme stress without their subjects knowing they were being observed. They believed that unconscious responses would provide more accurate data than conscious choices. But they were wrong. The most valuable data came from our conscious decision to expose their study despite knowing we were still being observed. Conscious choice under extreme stress. That's what actually determines who lives and who dies when the systems fail and the ice starts cracking beneath your feet.